Each episode of the Granada series begins with Patrick Gower's iconic theme, accompanied by equally iconic imagery of Baker Street. A few titles also grace the screen: The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and Developed for Television by John Hawkesworth. Now, in recent shows, we've discussed Michael Cox, the man who was the driving force behind the series, but neither his name nor that of Jeremy Brett is anywhere to be found in the opening titles. So who was this mysterious contributor, and how is it that he rates such a prominent screen credit? Before we dive into tonight's tale, let's take a moment to meet Mr. John Hawkesworth. Born in London in 1920, Hawkesworth was the son of an army officer, and at the age of 21 was himself commissioned with the Grenadier Guards, serving with the 4th Battalion throughout the Northwest Europe campaign, where he eventually rose to the rank of captain. Educated at Queen's College, he also spent a semester as an art student at Paris's Sorbonne, and was inspired by his time in Picasso's studio, enough so that as soon as his military enlistment ended, he began to paint. His work exhibited at a number of galleries, including the Royal Academy, where he attracted the attention of famed Hungarian art director Vincent Korda, who immediately put him to work in movies, serving in the art department on films such as Carol Reed's The Third Man and The Fallen Idol. By the 1950s, he was working freelance in film and television, and tried his hand at writing and producing many projects, including The Prisoner with Alec Guinness and Tiger Bay with John and Haley Mills. But in the 60s, he started to focus more intently on television, at which time he wrote and co-produced a series called The Short Stories of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, a show which sought to shine some light on Doyle's lesser-known non-Holmes tales. The series only lasted 13 episodes, but producer Michael Cox remembered it well, and it would serve as common ground when the two men began to collaborate many years later. But perhaps Hawkesworth's biggest success came in 1971, when he collaborated with Jean Marsh and Eileen Atkins to create the iconic British series Upstairs, Downstairs for ITV. The series was a great success, and its 68 episodes ran from 1971 to 1975, cementing Hawkesworth as a household name, as the series went on to win 2 BAFTA Awards, 2 Royal Television Society Awards, 3 Writers Guild Awards, 8 Emmys, and a Golden Globe. But it wasn't until 1980 that he would return to the work of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, when Michael Cox approached him to help develop his new series. To Peter Haining, Cox recalled, "I went to John right at the beginning. He was, of course, not only well known here, but also in America, which was an important factor in my plans. It seemed to me that with the help of someone like him, who is a writer and also a producer and a great television professional, I might find the right way through quite a number of tricky problems." In Bending the Willow, David Stewart Davies reports, "Initially, Cox and Hawkesworth proceeded to set certain ground rules as a guide to other writers. It was decided, for example, that Watson would not have a wife or a Mary Morstan romance, and that any chronologies which attempted to place the stories in certain years or a particular period of Holmes' life would be ignored. To the serious Sherlockian scholar, this may have seemed radical or even drastic, but one must remember that what Michael Cox and his team were dealing with was a popular drama series dedicated to bringing the essence of Sherlock Holmes to the television screens of millions of viewers, not a slavish, scholarly, and pedestrian retelling of the tales. The two drew up separate lists of stories they believed would make the strongest adaptations, and both were pleased to find that their lists corresponded almost entirely. Cox recalled, "John had Silver Blaze, and I think I had the Bruce Partington plans, but we both had Speckled Band, the Red-Headed League, A Scandal in Bohemia, the Blue Carbuncle, in fact, what you get in the first 13 programs." And so it began. Hawkesworth went to work hiring writers and supervising the scripts, while Cox took on casting and the building of Baker Street. But to Peter Haining, he remembered, "John Hawkesworth gave me a wonderful start, because by the time we were ready to begin filming, that absolutely essential, precious work of scriptwriting was complete, and he handed me 13 splendid scripts to get on with." Cox also recalled, "It was John Hawkesworth's idea to preface each of the cases with a short action sequence showing an element of the mystery which Holmes will have to solve. This is a stylistic device which turns up in a lot of movies, but it was particularly valuable to us in showing the uninitiated that there was more to look forward to than two fellows chatting in Baker Street." In the end, we settled on the credit, "Developed for Television" by John Hawkesworth, which is a fair tribute to John's clear-sightedness about the original material and his influence on all the early scripts. Hawkesworth's involvement in the series would ebb and flow in the later years of the show, mainly due to internal politics, his final script being the Boscombe Valley Mystery in 1991. But his contributions to the creation of the Granada series are myriad, and he will always be remembered as one of the show's founding fathers. John Hawkesworth died in Leicester in 2003 at the age of 82. Tonight's tale begins with the sound of raised voices, culminating in a woman calling out the name David, followed by a scream. Unable to force the door, a concerned servant races around the outside of the house, entering from the yard. As the grisly scene unfolds, we see an unconscious woman lying next to the body of her husband, a dead man, whose head lies in a pool of his own blood. And so begins the adventure of the Crooked Man. But the Crooked Man was not actually meant to be part of the first series at all. In his book, A Study in Celluloid, Michael Cox recalled, "Although Holmes calls it one of the strangest cases which ever perplexed a man's brain, this was not a story that I was keen to do. But John Hawkesworth and his comrade in arms from the Guards and upstairs downstairs, Alfred Shaughnessy, persuaded me that it would provide a change of pace in our first group. In fact, the script went through several versions before I was prepared to give it to the director. This was Alan Grint, who had already done the Naval Treaty successfully, and was attracted to the spectacular opportunities for flashbacks to the Indian Mutiny. I still had misgivings, and would have preferred to go with Bill Craig's script for the Reigate Squire, but I surrendered." Even as Act 1 of the episode begins, fans of the series will quickly notice something different here. This is the only episode of Season 1 that does not begin with Holmes and Watson on Baker Street. Instead, they make their way to the offices of the 1st Battalion of the Royal Mallows, stationed at Aldershot Garrison, where they are promptly met by a Major Murphy.
It's good of you to come so swiftly.
Not at all. I've explained to Holmes how concerned you must be about the possibility of a scandal.
Thank you. The honor of the regiment is in my care.
And yet, the newspaper's reports suggest that a scandal is inevitable.
Well, surely not. I've done my utmost to make sure that reporters were kept as far away as possible.
Exactly, and that is what has made them suspicious. They scent a mystery. That much is clear from the little they have been able to say.
Well, Surely it would be wrong to repeat, to draw attention to...
Quite.
You see how much we need your help, Mr. Holmes.
Holmes' agitation with his friend's decision to involve him in a military matter is clear from the onset. And when Major Murphy resorts to small talk instead of delving into the details of the case, Holmes begins to lose patience.
What do you say, Holmes?
What can I say? Major Murphy, you have told me nothing! I have come down here after persuasion from my friend to Aldershot, who has more interest in military matters than I. Now that I am here, please, tell me the facts.
The commanding officer of this regiment, Colonel James Berkeley, was found dead in his villa at about 10 o'clock the night before last. The body was found by Private Bates, his batman, lying in the morning room. There was a ragged cut 2 inches long in the back of his head, which had evidently been caused by a violent blow from a blunt instrument. And upon the floor by the body was a singular hand-carved wooden club. Also, stretched out on the sofa, lying in a dead faint, was Mrs. Berkeley.
Please continue, Major Murphy.
Murphy goes on to explain that Colonel Berkeley was highly regarded by his men, in spite of his background as a lowly private soldier. An impressive military career resulted in rapid promotion over the years, and eventually he married Nancy Devoy, daughter of the regimental sergeant major, in spite of the fact that her hand was sought after by almost all of the men in the regiment. But now Nancy Berkeley lies hospitalized, traumatized and unconscious, and under police supervision, suspected of murder. A carved wooden club, presumably the murder weapon, being found near her at the scene of the crime. Murphy also reveals that the Berkeley marriage was not an entirely happy one, as Colonel Berkeley was known to have fits of jealousy. And, more strangely, he was also known to have spells of deep depression when reminiscing about the past.
Sometimes, when we were discussing old campaigns, Crimea, Mutiny, Afghan War, the smile would often be struck from his mouth as if by some invisible hand.
Yes, long service in India can have that effect. I saw that when I was in the Berkshires.
You mentioned a carved wooden club found by the body. One of the Colonel's Indian souvenirs.
I believe the servants deny ever having seen this club before. Certainly I've never seen it on any of my visits. It was quite long.
And the police, I suppose, have retained it for examination.
Yes. They believe it to be the murder weapon.
Do they indeed? Do you know, I think we should begin by visiting the Berkeley's house. Unless, of course, it is possible to interview Mrs. Berkeley.
I'm afraid she's still unconscious.
I thought as much.
Our Major Murphy is played by one Mr. Paul Chapman. A solid character actor with 75 IMDb credits to his name, Mr. Chapman seems to be best remembered for playing the role of Captain George Brent in the World War II series Colditz, as well as the role of Stephen in As Time Goes By, where he acted alongside Judi Dench and Jeffrey Palmer. Mr. Chapman appears to have retired in recent years, with his final reported role being that of the caretaker in the 2013 independent film The Selfish Giant, which debuted at Cannes and was based on the Oscar Wilde story of the same name. Adherence to Conan Doyle's original story proved difficult for the writers to maintain with this particular adaptation, and as we will see, those decisions would eventually come to a head with Jeremy Brett and David Burke. But even early in the episode, the differences are clear. Michael Cox remembered, "We stood the first part of the story on its head and assumed that Watson, the military man, had brought the case to Holmes. We went on to assume that Holmes would hate all things military with, quote, his whole bohemian soul, end quote. Jeremy took this assumption rather too much to heart and played the early scenes with complete contempt for the Army establishment. Paul Chapman, who played Major Murphy, found this a little difficult to understand. You can almost hear him saying, "Why does this man stalking around my office and checking up on the dusting hate me so intensely?" Which Holmes appears to do until Murphy mentions how well he knows the dead man's widow. The possibility that he knows her too well makes Murphy a suspect, and Holmes begins to warm to him as a result. It's an interesting interpretation of Holmes's attitude to the Army. If we could do it again, I would say to Jeremy, come on, don't be so cross in this one, especially the early scenes. Later, at the Barclay house, Holmes learns that Mrs. Barclay had been out the night before, helping the poor by distributing old clothes to the needy. She returned late that night, stricken and pale. A drunk Colonel Barclay, in one of his jealous fits, confronted her, locking the door behind him.
And that presumably was the last time that anyone saw Colonel Barclay alive.
Yes, sir.
Can you think of any reason why your mistress came into this morning room at that time of night, when the fire was unlit?
No, sir.
Did she often make a point of purposely avoiding the Colonel? Had you ever heard them arguing before?
Not to my knowledge, sir.
When you returned from the kitchen with Mrs. Barclay's tea, you found the door locked and you heard voices raised. Now, what exactly did you hear?
They were arguing, sir. Mrs. Barclay called the Colonel a coward. She said, "You have ruined my life all these years." Mrs. Barclay shouted the name David. She said it twice.
David?
Could you swear to that?
It was perfectly clear, sir.
But the Colonel's name was James.
Have you ever heard Mrs. Barclay refer to anyone called David?
No, sir. I don't think she or the Colonel knew anyone by the name of David.
The servants go on to report that Colonel Barclay died with a look of abject terror on his face, almost as though he had foreseen his own death. And what's more, the key to the locked door was never located. Holmes deduces that the evidence would indicate the presence of a third person, and he directs his attention to the lawn outside the room, where he finds the footprints of the unknown third party. But once back inside, Holmes finds another clue.
Watson, look at this.
What is it?
Our intruder had a somewhat unusual companion.
It's a dog, isn't it? Somebody's dog.
Who ever heard of a dog running up a curtain?
What about a cat, then?
These paw marks are not those of a cat, not of a monkey, nor of any creature that we are familiar with. I would think from hind foot to forefoot, at least 15 inches. Add to that the length of neck and head. You have a creature of no less than 2 feet. More if there's a tail. And the length of its stride is odd. It indicates a creature with a long back and short legs.
Something like a stoat or a weasel?
We also know that it is carnivorous.
How can you tell that?
Well, you see what made it run up the curtain.
A canary.
Exactly.
Then what was this beast?
Next, their investigation leads them to the shelter where Mrs. Barclay volunteered on that fateful night. There, they are met by her friend, a Miss Morrison, who reluctantly breaks her friend's confidence to provide answers to the questions that Mr. Holmes seeks. On the night in question, she and Miss Barclay were going about their work when they encountered one extraordinarily stricken man.
Not only had he a crooked back, but he was lame and walked with his knees bent. His face was darkly tanned, crinkled and puckered like a withered apple. I thought to myself that truly there are some of us on this earth who are burdened with more than their fair share of misfortune. This vision was made more unusual by the oriental garb the man was wearing. I pointed this person out to Nancy as someone especially deserving of help. Nancy had indeed been in good spirits that evening, and I saw her go towards the man and ask him if he needed assistance. It was now that a change came over Nancy. She had begun a conversation with the man when suddenly all the color drained from her face. She looked as though she had seen a ghost. The man, too, seemed to be strangely affected by the sight of her, and I saw him gesticulating wildly. Well, Nancy and the man went to a quiet corner of the hall, and they talked together for a few moments or so before I heard an angry shout from the man and saw him storm out, waving his fists in the air.
Nancy, what is it? Are you all right? Who was that poor creature?
Oh, it's an old acquaintance of mine, fallen on hard times. Promise me, Annie, you won't say anything about this to anyone. Promise me.
Of course I promise, if you so wish.
Thank you.
And the identity of this man?
I thought you might ask me that. Well, after this terrible happening, Nancy left. I naturally made a few inquiries among some of the regulars. Such an unusual-looking creature has, of course, attracted attention. It appears he is an old soldier recently back from India. And no one knows anything else about his background, except that he makes a living by entertaining the troops. Conjuring tricks, that kind of thing.
The face of Miss Morrison is probably very familiar to any Harry Potter fans out there as that of Fiona Shaw, a.k.a. Petunia Dursley, the torturous aunt who forced Harry to live under the stairs. Miss Shaw's had a most impressive career, and the Granada Holmes series was either her first or second acting credit, depending on where you look. The Irish-born actress trained at the Royal Academy for Dramatic Arts in London, and has worked extensively with the Royal Shakespeare Company and the National Theatre. She's won numerous awards for her performances over the years, including a BAFTA in 2018 for her work on BBC America's Killing Eve, and she also famously played the male lead in Shakespeare's Richard II in Deborah Warner's 1995 production of that play. And I'm quite sure she will continue to be active in the film and theater worlds for many years to come. As it turns out, the scenes shot in the charity mission between Henry Wood and Nancy Barclay may have been the most contentious ones filmed up to that point, as this part of the screenplay called for significant changes to the original story, and the cast and crew found themselves at odds once again. But this time, it was nearly the straw that broke the camel's back. To David Stewart Davies, David Burke recalled, "There are some discrepancies in the film compared with the original story. Now, in Conan Doyle's words, they walk toward each other down a darkened street as they pass under a street lamp. He looks up and he cries out in recognition. It's a most poignant moment. These two people who had loved each other. She thought he was dead, and now she sees him alive, but he has become this terrible, crooked creature. It's a touching scene, meeting under this Victorian gas lamp. If I were a filmmaker, I would not need to change a thing to capture the poignant magic of that scene. But for reasons best known to the director and the writer, the scene was transposed into a crowded Salvation Army-style bazaar, which, to my mind, destroyed all the poignancy of it and the isolation of these two figures. There was a big row over that. Jeremy and I were very angry about the change. Blood was almost spilt, and tears were shed. I'm afraid we lost the battle. But Jeremy was never selfish in that regard. He was always thinking about the wider scene, and I thought it was grossly insensitive of the director and the writer to transpose that scene and to be unable to see that they had ruined it. It was like scribbling over a beautiful picture." Michael Cox and John Hawkesworth acknowledged the disagreement, but stuck to their guns. Cox recalled, "In the story, Miss Morrison describes how she and Nancy were walking home through a suburban street and by complete coincidence encountered the crooked man who recognizes Nancy and, having spoken to her, is left under a street lamp, shaking his fists in the air. Perhaps we should have found a suitable street, cleared it of cars and TV aerials, redressed some houses with Victorian doors and windows, erected a practical period gas lamp and set up an expensive night shoot. But instead we put the meeting into a believable context, the mission, to which the old soldier had come to find some cast-off clothes. I do not believe that very much was lost, and we certainly gained an appropriate location for the crucial evidence of Miss Morrison." But the confrontation deeply affected Jeremy Brett, who had fought and won so many battles for canonical continuity up to that point, that he took this defeat extremely personally. To the writers of the Sherlock Holmes Gazette, he remembered, "By the time we got to the crooked man, we were so far away from the story that I despaired. I went to them and said that I would lose interest in the project if they didn't stick closer to Doyle's original. I was committed to the first 13, so I could not have left, but my heart nearly broke." Disagreements aside, the team sallied forth and continued to bring the episode to life. Later, at the Garrison pub, Holmes and Watson are quick to identify the poor soul whom they seek. The disfigured man, garbed in shabby robes, performs magic tricks for the drunken soldiers and their mistresses. For his grand finale, he reveals a very special assistant, a mongoose. But as the crooked man finishes his routine, Holmes confronts him, and together they find a quiet room in the back where they can speak undisturbed. After lighting a lamp, Mr. Henry Wood wastes no time in getting to the point.
"She is innocent. You can take my word for it."
Then you are guilty.
No, I am not guilty.
Then who struck the colonel down?
It was a just providence that killed him. His own guilty conscience.
I think you'd better explain.
God, if I had smashed his head in, as it was in my heart to do, he would have got only what he deserved from me. No. I never laid a hand on him. I was spared the trouble. I'll tell you my story. There is no cause for me to be ashamed of it. You see me now, with my back like a camel, and my ribs all awry. But there was a time when Corporal Henry Wood was the smartest man in the Royal Mallows.
You were in the same regiment as Colonel Berkeley?
Oh, yes. But he was Sergeant Jim Berkeley then. We were in the same company. And we had something else in common. We were both in love with the same woman, Nancy Devoy.
Yes, the daughter of the regimental sergeant major.
Yeah. There were two men who loved her. But only one whom she loved. You'll laugh when you look at this poor thing huddled in front of the fire and hear me say that it was for my good looks that Nancy loved me.
Mr. Wood explains how Nancy's father did not approve of him. He preferred Barclay, but Nancy was true to her man. Things came unraveled, however, during the mutiny of 1857. Their unit was surrounded, pinned down, and it fell to Wood to take on a dangerous mission to leave the camp and bring reinforcements to their aid. Reluctantly, he volunteered, not because of his love of country or the regiment, but because he feared for the life of the woman he loved, Nancy Devoy. But it was Barclay who was tasked with providing him directions to the reinforcements via a path through enemy lines, and it wasn't long before Wood realized that he had been betrayed by his old comrade. Barclay's directions led him straight into the hands of the enemy. Wood was tortured, hung up in a tree, contorting his body. But even as the tide of battle turned and the rebels retreated in the face of British superiority, they took Wood along with them as a slave, torturing him year after year, breaking every bone of his body until he could stand upright no more. He often thought of ending it all, but the hatred he felt for Barclay kept him going. Years later, when his captors were murdered by a rival faction of Afghan tribesmen, he finally escaped back to the village and began living with the natives, a broken man.
Why? I'll tell you straight. I preferred my Nancy and my old pals in the Royal Mallows to go on believing that Harry Wood died a hero's death, with a straight back, and see him crawling about the world, more like a chimpanzee than a human being.
But you did return. And to Aldershot, where your old regiment was stationed. Why?
I just wanted to see the old country once more before I died. I saved what I could. And eventually, I got a show. I didn't know the regiment was stationed here in Aldershot. I just wanted to be where there were soldiers. I could earn my keep, going round the canteens, doing my tricks to entertain them. And I no longer wanted to kill Barclay. The fires of revenge had burnt low over the years. Until I saw her.
That night, he had made his way to the shelter in search of some better clothes, when, as if by some dark twist of fate, he was confronted by his long-lost love, Nancy. And within moments, she knew that the strange man before her was no stranger at all.
Good evening. Can I help you? Have you been able to find anything that... I'm sorry, I thought I...
Nancy, it is me. Don't be afraid.
I thought you had been dead these 30 years.
I have been. I swore you'd never see me like this.
The shock of being face to face with her again caused all of his old wounds to reopen. He told her all about Barclay's betrayal at Bertie and stormed out. But feeling remorse, he followed her home, only to find Barclay confronting her in a jealous rage. Once Barclay laid his hands upon her, his fate was sealed. Wood entered the window, and the sight of him was too much for Barclay to handle. His heart gave out, and Colonel Barclay was dead before his head hit the ground, his wife falling faint beside him. In a panic, Wood took the key, intending to open the door for help, but he quickly realized that it would look black against him, so he fled. But only after collecting his friend Teddy, who had escaped his box and made his way up a nearby curtain, in search of a canary.
So the Colonel died before he struck his head on the fender.
An apoplectic fit brought on by shock.
Mr. Wood, provided the coroner reaches the same conclusion, Mrs. Barclay...
Nancy.
...will be free. I trust you would have no objection to repeating your story to the police, should the need arise.
Mr. Holmes. How is Nancy?
She's in hospital. I understand in time she should make a complete recovery.
Thank God.
Holmes and Watson show themselves out, and Henry Wood opens his locket, revealing the silhouette of the only true love he ever knew. Now, we've met some of the cast already, but the roles of our main characters are certainly worthy of note. Norman Jones, who played the crooked man, Henry Wood, had an amazing career with tons of recurring roles in so many shows, ranging from Coronation Street to Doctor Who, where he played multiple recurring roles over numerous seasons. His resume is really nothing short of remarkable. Normally, when I look up a British actor, it's common to see a guest appearance here and there, but Norman Jones seems to have been the exception to that rule, recurring on most of the shows he was in. Born in 1932 in Shropshire, his first screen role took place in 1962 on his 30th birthday. He worked consistently until 1992. He died in 2013 at age 80. Lisa Danieli, who played Nancy, had no less of an impressive career. Born in Reading, Berkshire in 1929 and educated in Paris, she made her film debut at the age of 21 and worked continually through her young life, also making appearances on Doctor Who and other British films and TV shows. She was perhaps best known for her role as Diane Brady in the 1958 ITC series based on H.G. Wells' Invisible Man. Her role in the Granada Holmes series was actually one of her last. She retired from acting altogether in 1996. She died in 2014 at age 84. And Dennis Hawthorne, who played Barclay, was no less impressive than his counterparts. Born in Northern Ireland in 1932, he too has an amazing list of credits. From King Duncan in the Royal Shakespeare Company's Macbeth, to a lead role in Gwyneth Paltrow's film of Jane Austen's Emma, he also appeared in 46 episodes of the hit series Within These Walls, and was a recurring character on Doctor Who. Sadly, in his last years, he suffered a stroke which affected his memory and speech, and he was forced to retire from acting. Although, according to the author of his Guardian obituary, it had the unforeseen effect of allowing him to express his feelings towards his family and friends much more openly. He passed away in 2009 in East Sussex. And as if the gravitas of that cast list was not enough to launch this episode out of the stratosphere, the casting of these characters as their younger selves is, at very least, equally as intriguing. Young Henry Wood, played by Michael Lumsden, got his start on the Granada series and continues to have an active career, making recurring appearances in many shows like House of Anubis, My Good Friend, and EastEnders. Young Barclay will probably be familiar to many. James Wilby has gone on to become a distinguished leading actor in many British films, including Maurice, Howard's End, Gosford Park, and A Handful of Dust, to say nothing of countless television roles. And young Nancy was portrayed by Catherine Rabette, who went on to build an impressive resume of film and television credits, including recurring roles on You Rang, My Lord and Emmerdale. But she perhaps had her brightest moment in the spotlight when she became romantically involved with Prince Andrew, Duke of York, in the 1980s. So, quite a lot of famous faces to look for in this one, and not a bad performance to be found. But finally, back at Baker Street, Holmes and Watson smoke and reflect on their recent adventure.
Holmes, there's just one thing I don't understand. If the Colonel's name was James, and Wood was called either Henry or Harry, then who the deuce was David?
My dear Watson, that name David should have told me the whole story. Had I been the ideal reasoner, which you are so fond of depicting, but alas, my powers of deduction failed me. You see, David, in this case, was evidently used as a term of reproach.
Reproach?
Don't you remember how King David sent Uriah the Hittite into the forefront of the battle to die so that he might steal his woman Bathsheba? I think you'll find the story in the first or second book of Samuel. My Old Testament is a little rusty.
You're quite right, Holmes. Second book of Samuel, chapter 11, verses 14 to 17. You appear to have looked it up yourself. Since we returned home from Aldershot.
How did you know?
You used this bill for our meal at Waterloo as a bookmarker, did you not?
Excellent, Watson.
Elementary, my dear Holmes.
Original air date on the ITV network was May 22nd, 1984, at 9 p.m. Dramatized by Alfred Shaughnessy and directed by Alan Grint. Now, we spoke a good deal about director Alan Grint back on the Naval Treaty, and we'll see him again for the Greek Interpreter and The Final Problem, so we won't say much more about him now. But writer Alfred Shaughnessy came to the series via John Hawkesworth, with whom he had worked for many years on the hit series Upstairs, Downstairs. Hawkesworth asked him to pen The Crooked Man, which would be his only episode of the Granada series. An impressive 47 IMDb writing credits, 2 novels, and multiple memoirs to his name, his family history is equally as impressive. Born in 1916, his grandfather was Thomas Shaughnessy, an American-born Canadian railway administrator who was made Baron of the city of Montreal in that same year. His mother was a second cousin of James Polk, the 11th U.S. President. Alfred grew up in Tennessee, but in 1920 his mother married Sir Piers Legge, who then became equerry to the Prince of Wales, and they moved to Norfolk Square in London. The family had a full staff of servants, and the Prince of Wales later visited the house for dinner, which Alfred drew upon when writing the classic Upstairs, Downstairs episode, Guest of Honor. Alfred Shaughnessy died in 2005 at the age of 89. But let's relax now and light up our church wardens as we're joined by my co-host, Luke. Who had gotten in through the French door and then left Berkeley dead in his gore? Sherlock wondered what creature could have left the strange feature of those puzzling paw prints on the floor. Isaac Asimov's Sherlockian Limericks, The Crooked Man.
So, there's a comedian in France who's known as the French Jerry Seinfeld, Gad Elmaleh, who says they don't have French doors in France.
What kind of doors do they have in France?
Just regular doors.
Yeah. Well, I've had a hard time coming to grips with this episode of the Granada series, The Crooked Man, and I'll explain why, and you can tell me your thoughts. You know, before I knew anything about the backstory of this episode, I enjoyed it quite a bit because I thought Jeremy Brett is high energy, really angry and agitated in this episode, and I really liked it, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah.
I thought he was really pointed and barbed, and now that I know more about the episode and I know the difficulties that they were having on the set with this one, it makes me wonder whether I like it as much as I did. I mean, how much of that was
transferred to the screen?
Well, how much of it was acting and how much of it was behind-the-scenes pent-up hostilities?
Well, there's things I noticed on this watch that aren't in the story, so I wondered if they were things like that, like almost pointing them out to the audience that they weren't in the story. Because when they show up at the regimental offices,
yeah,
there's a gurney rolling by.
Right.
and he looks at it weird. It looks like it could mean something poignant, but it kind of doesn't.
Yeah, I thought about that too. I was like, just by his look, he's alluding to the fact that it's like a hospital gurney that would carry out a dead body or something like that.
Right.
But is that even really what that was?
Like it was the colonel just got dumped.
Right. Carted off.
But then once he gets inside Major Murphy's office, he's like checking the
dusting,
yeah. And like he just opens the door and looks in the hall and closes it.
Yeah,
he just seems unsettled.
Right. Well, and again, like in the books, somebody gave him a note and said, "We're going to make a decision here that Holmes is anti-military."
Right.
And Jeremy Brett really took that over the top. I just wonder, because I know there was a lot of anger behind this one. I know that Jeremy Brett and David Burke had a big fight with Michael Cox and John Hawkesworth about changing that scene in the alley when they meet under the street lamp to the mission.
Right.
And I mean, you know how those kind of fights go on a set or whatnot, and it's I'm sure there was a lot of tears, and so like, how did that carry over into the episode? It's just one of those things where once you know that, it's kind of hard to watch this one without feeling that was happening at the same time, and it's really tainted my viewing of it. I mean, I watched it once before I started, reading any of the books, doing any of the research, just to enjoy it, just to watch it one more time, take it in before we did the episode.
Yeah.
Then I started reading the books, and then when I watched it every other time, it was like, wow, I just feel like this kind of seeded anger about this episode from everybody.
Well, I didn't know that before I watched it, and I did have this feeling, obviously, from other episodes, that Holmes he's not impressed by the military.
Right.
And then in this one, he's like perturbed to have to even be there.
Right.
But in the story, it's all him, and he just is telling Watson the story on his couch at night.
Right.
So they obviously, that's a pretty drastic change.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and they had to do that. They had to turn it on its head, because how else could they do this one? This is the weird thing. This is why I'm so torn up about this one, because I think really most of the changes were good. Like I would normally say, let's stick to the story, let's stick to the canon. But I feel like in this particular one, I kind of like the mission set. We'll never know what it would have looked like under the street lamp, but I thought it worked really well. I thought it was effective. I thought it was well done.
I bet somebody was thinking that's going to be too hard to shoot.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah. Michael Cox said exactly that.
Okay.
Yeah.
In a way that, you can convey what's on the page.
Right. I mean, but even if you take apart the the door fronts and the windows and the bringing in a gas lamp and all these other things, just two people happening to meet on the street in the middle of a city under one lamp.
Yeah, and then he starts screaming.
Right. It's really.
It could have come off poorly.
It could have failed.
But that being said, one of the notes that I made was how much bigger this episode feels than some of the other ones.
Yeah.
There are a lot of on location scenes in what is meant to be India.
Yeah.
But then there's like battle scenes and explosions and things.
Yeah. Yeah, the director, Alan Grint, that's half the reason he wanted to do this one, because he was so excited about doing the flashback stuff.
But that's a pretty big departure from the page.
Yeah, it's a really different episode than the story, and Jeremy Brett was really upset about it. I mean, in the Sherlock Holmes Gazette, he's like, by the time we got to that one, we were so far away from the canon that I was depressed. Like he was depressed about it. But again, it's like I almost always side with Jeremy Brett, but on this one, I kind of feel like most of the choices made I think they worked out pretty well.
I think so. I mean, otherwise it would have just turned into somebody quoting somebody else. I actually noticed in the book, I don't know what it's called, when there's double quotes.
Oh, right.
And
a quote of a quote?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the Baron Gould book, it's a quote and then a single quote and then another double quote before someone talks. So it's like it would have just been somebody telling somebody else's story inside somebody else's story.
Yeah. Well, all of that aside, starting right at the beginning, as Jeremy Brett starts yelling, I got to say, I just love it. I just love Jeremy Brett in this episode. And honestly, I'm going to just jump totally to the other side of the page now. I think this might be the best David Burke episode up to this point. Because, frankly, he feels like he has something to do in this one. You know, he strides into the Royal Mallows garrison with confidence.
Yeah, right.
You know, he's a full character in this moment. He's not just a springboard for Holmes to think.
And Holmes looks proud of him.
Yeah.
For all of his military knowledge and knowing the ins and outs.
Yeah, I thought that was, I mean, it's really nice. And then, of course, it flops the other way pretty quickly when Holmes gets agitated.
Yeah.
But
well, I think he's impressed by Watson. He's proud of Watson, but doesn't want to be there.
Yeah.
Is what it seems like.
Right, exactly. And the Royal Mallows versus the Royal Munsters. Did you read about that?
Yeah. Well, we should say not a lot of annotations.
Yeah, there's almost like nothing in the Leslie Klinger or the Baring Gould.
Apart from just, again, crap talking his dates and train times.
Right. Yeah. And there's so many little things like that in this one especially. You wonder why any Sherlockian cares about these things.
I think they just wanted to get something on the page.
Yeah.
And there's nothing else to pick apart in this one.
Yeah. But it's just obvious. I mean, after you've read just a handful of these stories, you start to realize that Conan Doyle just made stuff up.
Yeah.
He just made everything up.
Well, it's fiction.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the Royal Mallows are not real, but the Royal Munsters, which only appears in I think the U.S. versions, right?
It's a nom de guerre for the battalion, the Royal Irish Fusiliers.
Yeah. If you look up the Royal Mallows on the internet, it only has really one entry, which is a fictitious group created by Arthur Conan Doyle based on the Royal Munsters. But even the Royal Munsters in this situation isn't real either, because those regiments only go up to the number 109 at that time, and this is the 117th, so it's just Conan Doyle making stuff up again, you know. But this episode is very compartmentalized. You know, we start off at the garrison, and then we move to the house, and then we move to the mission, and then we move to the bar at the end. And it's kind of just those segments, and it's done. And we're at Baker Street at the end for a few minutes. But everything just feels very contained. But each little contained part is quite good, I think. They're all very, very solid. There's great people in each one.
Well, you can't forget the carriage ride with one of the best Watson lines.
Yeah.
Which is, mild adultery has always been commonplace among officers and their wives serving in hot climates. Thank you, Watson, for educating me in military morality.
It's a good line. And it's funny because clearly if you watch that on Blu-ray on a big TV, neither one of their mouths are moving that entire scene.
Yeah.
It was just kind of voiceover they added in a wide shot. It's kind of funny. Well, I don't know. We've talked about the garrison. We've talked about, Holmes and Watson there. But, when they move to the house and they're talking to Jane, the house servant.
Yeah.
That's probably my favorite moment of the episode, is when you can't even recreate it. You know what I mean? With the things that Holmes was doing when he's like, did you ever see them arguing?
Mm-hmm.
And then when she says no, he kind of just does this thing with his face and his hands, and it's like, it's so brilliant. I've sat there in front of my TV trying to recreate what he just did.
Yeah.
It's not easy to do. That's just a great little moment. I love his attitude. I love the way that she's keeping him at bay, and he's escalating it with his, you can just tell he's getting angrier.
Well, and he slaps some blood sample and hair samples in front of her.
Completely unnecessary, just to shock her a little bit.
To see if she'd be shocked.
Yeah.
And then on her way out the door, he says, "Oh, Major Murphy once left a cigarette case. Did you ever find it for him?"
Yeah.
She's like, "Yep," and then she leaves.
Right.
Because it was caught her in a lie.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like they could have pushed a little harder on that moment. They could have made it seem like he was really getting a gotcha moment on her.
Yeah.
But
I think it's maybe a subtle Jeremy Brett thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So we need to talk about the Colonel's face.
Yeah.
When they talk about the contortion of the Colonel's face, and it was the most dreadful expression of fear anyone had ever seen or whatever. But the on-screen version of that is a little less than...
Let's just say I have a good list and a bad list, and that was at the top of my bad list. It's a hard thing to sell. It's easier to put on the page.
I kind of want to be found dead like that.
Not quite sure if you're really happy or not.
Yeah. For them to go, we don't know what happened. This is really weird.
It's a weird one. I mean, if you read that on the page and it says, a face of terror, foreseeing your own death.
Made people vomit or
yeah,
faint.
It's so horrific. How do you get an actor to do that? It's a tall order.
The Ring.
What's that?
The Ring.
Sure. Yeah. That whole scene, I mean, again, like if we're talking about the bad stuff, my biggest complaint about this episode is just all the things that don't make any sense. I mean, I hate to say it because this story, it's not really about the mystery, frankly, to me, this particular one. It's about the drama. It's about the crooked man's sad story. And, Norman Jones, the actor who plays Henry Wood, he's beyond amazing in this episode.
Mm-hmm.
But everything else makes no sense. I mean, they find him laying on the fender of the fireplace, and they assume, in spite of the fact that it's probably sticking out of his head,
right,
that somehow somebody beat him over the head at a different moment and killed him. You know what I mean? That makes no sense.
Well, I don't think it's so much that it doesn't make sense as somebody had to make a decision on set.
What do you mean?
Well, if he would have, as it is in the story, he should have fallen, hit his head, and then fell over.
Yeah.
And for camera, they just stuck him on the fender.
But I just mean, you know what I mean? Clearly there's a fender there that's sharp with blood all over it and a matching gash in the back of his head. I mean, even by standards of the 1800s, they could have figured that one out. You know what I mean? The club that's laying there next to him has no blood on it and is not a sharp object. So why would they assume that's the murder weapon?
The only thing I'll say is they did cut around the blood. You see his face at the beginning, and then when the driver is over there discussing the scene, you can see the blood, but they don't really cut in on it. So I think maybe they thought that was a bad idea at some point, and they didn't do it.
I just assumed that was because of like TV code, like they couldn't show that much blood or something.
Well, they show a lot more blood later.
Yeah.
When it's just like a big pool of wax blood.
Right.
But did they say he has a cut on the back of his head, or they just? He said that in the book. I couldn't remember if they said it.
Yeah, they say that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, not to jump ahead, but speaking of blood, when Wood wakes up later when his captors are all killed and he's escaping, he's got blood all over his face.
Yeah.
If you watch that scene, it's clearly getting in his eyes.
Yeah.
Like the fake blood, because he can't keep his eyes open.
Yeah.
And he's just blinking. And it looks like really great acting, but I think his eyes were really irritated.
Yeah, so those scenes were great, though. So all that outdoor on-location stuff is really nice.
Yeah. A lot of production value.
Yeah. But going back to the coachman, the driver who finds him, how is it possible that he did not see Henry Wood going across the big giant lawn when he turned the corner? If you think about the timing of it, when she screams and he goes around the corner.
Well, I feel like it's just a timing thing.
It's just the magic of TV.
It's the magic of TV, but it's also like they made it seem like they were struggling with the door for a while.
Yeah.
And so maybe it was meant to be like he was there longer than, so he could have got away. And also in the book, it's like 30 yards to the street.
Yeah.
And in the episode, it's 100 yards or so. So it's a much further distance.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's just those little things that make me not love this episode as much as maybe I should for a season 1 episode. But
yeah.
I mean, the biggest complaint, the biggest continuity story complaint, whatever you want to call it, is Barkley was willing to sacrifice his only hope of being rescued. Like he sends, the guy's going off to get help to save the entire garrison, and he throws him to the dogs. And
well, more importantly, he's giving an officer over to the rebels.
Yeah.
And they could have tortured him for information.
Yeah.
I don't know what information he would have had.
Yeah.
But strategy-wise, not brilliant.
But it's just kind of like, what good would it have done if they all got massacred because Henry Wood didn't get help?
Maybe he knew something we don't.
Yeah.
Or maybe they just sent it out another guy.
Yeah. Well, for all the bad stuff, let's talk about the good stuff, because frankly, there's so much good stuff. Watson, I don't know, everything about him in this episode, I just think this is one of his best ones. I just think there's very few moments where it's a little bit, there's a couple of guffaw kind of moments where he's got his eyes big and his mouth open.
The one which was, then there must have been a third person.
Right.
and he's actually like at the back of frame on that one.
Yeah, and he's at the back of frame and he's kind of a little bit out of focus, but my God, his expressions are so gigantic that it doesn't matter that he's out of focus. You can just see like his complete surprise at this revelation. It's like, wow.
I wonder if David Burke was happy to have a bit more meat.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Noticing things like, so the footsteps, when they're tracking the footsteps outside.
Yeah.
Always a good moment.
Yeah.
But then Holmes runs for like a football field.
Yeah.
Tracking.
Yeah. Yeah, I love those moments because, again, Jeremy Brett's so young and full of life, and you know, it's. I love seeing him move that way. I love those moments. There's a lot to say about this episode that's good. The framing and the camera moves, I didn't really ever think about them until maybe just the last viewing, but it's a lot of creative shots, a lot of focus pulling, a lot of, you know, bringing something into the frame, moving the camera, bringing something else into the frame, moving the camera.
There's a cool shot where the servants and everybody are rushing to the door, and there's a camera on a dolly on like the second floor, on the ground, on the floor of the second floor, and like pulling back through the railing.
Yeah,
that was a pretty cool shot, and it's just a half a second shot or something. It was pretty cool.
Yeah, no, I mean, those kind of shots take a lot longer than other shots to set up, and I don't know how much time they had on this episode, but they did a lot with the time they had. I mean, especially like you said, when you come to think of the on location battle scenes and everything else. I mean,
then to go and set up a shot like that.
Yeah,
you're just burning time.
Yeah, and I mean, I've said it, but like maybe it's sacrilegious to say, but like I said, I think the changes that they made for the adaptation of this one were the best possible ones they could do. I mean, there's just a lot of little things like wading through icy waters instead of walking along a dried out riverbank. You know, like that's a great, and the line they add into the script about that, about, you know, what does he say? That icy water that had just been snow in the Himalayas a few days ago. Yeah. It's a great line. It's a great moment. Everything about that sequence is good.
And those little hats where they're suspended around their mouths.
Oh, right. Yeah.
That doesn't jump off the page at you.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and I mean, even the end, even the very end of the episode when he says, "Elementary, my dear Holmes," obviously that's not in the story. Obviously that's a riff on popular culture because Holmes never even says these things, but
he does say elementary in this
in this particular story.
In the story.
Yeah.
So it was kind of a fun nod back and forth.
But... Yeah. But it was, again, just exceptionally well written and executed, those little moments. And I love it when Jeremy Brett goes, "Excellent, Watson."
Yeah. Yeah.
That's one of my favorite moments.
How about Watson's flash smoking jacket?
Yeah.
That's a hell of a smoking jacket.
Yeah, it is. And it's, again, kind of one of those moments that is almost over the top because his line there, "Hold on just a minute, there's one thing I don't understand."
Yeah.
The cliche of all detective stories.
Yeah.
Unfortunately. I don't think they do it very often in the Sherlock Holmes series. But...
True, but it is in the story as well.
Oh, that's right. It is. That's right. Yeah, I mean, and as the episode ends, the first time I sat down to watch it in a while, it ends with the credits starting to roll on Henry Wood, and I thought, oh no, we're not going to get the Sidney Paget illustrations. Mm-hmm. But after a few minutes, they do kick in, so I was happy.
I tried to read this one as I was watching it, and it was very distracting because the story all takes place on basically Watson's couch for the most part. And so it was really hard to know where you were trying to read along. But there was a few lines that stuck out as odd. This line made me laugh. Here's Simpson to report. "He's in all right, Mr. Holmes. Quite a small street Arab."
Yeah, they in the Klinger book, there's an annotation about that. It says, "Brewer's Dictionary of Phrase and Fable defines them as, quote, the homeless poor, street children, so called because, like the Arabs, they are nomads or wanderers with no settled home." So, I don't know. Old language, insensitive. Yeah.
It stuck out to me.
Yeah.
The other part that stuck out to me was when Watson describing this guy's face. He says, "But the face he turned towards us, though worn and swarthy, must at some time have been remarkable for its beauty."
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to imagine what Henry Wood should look like. When you look at the illustrations in the Strand and also in Collier's, I'm always kind of surprised at how uncrooked he is in those pictures. He kind of just looks like a guy with a little bit of a hunchback and not really a big problem. He doesn't look terrible in most of the pictures to me.
Might be hard to draw.
Yeah, I feel like they did a good job in the show, but
yeah,
the first time I saw the illustrations, I was like, wow, I expected him to be a complete mess.
Yeah,
you know?
Well, in the one, he just looks like he's sitting in a chair.
Right. But speaking of Simpson, of the Baker Street Boys, as he refers to them in this one, the Irregulars, they're actually only mentioned in 3 total stories: Study in Scarlet, Sign of 4, and this story. So this is one of the rare few stories.
By name?
As the Irregulars or by the Baker Street Boys, they're only ever mentioned 3 times. So as legendary as they are, it's kind of like Moriarty, you know.
Well, that's true.
Is it different in the show? I was trying to think about that.
I was trying to think. Don't they come in on like the Blue Carbuncle, or am I thinking the Sign of 4?
Well, they're definitely in the Sign of 4. I don't know. We'll have to keep an eye out for that because I can't remember. I feel like he does use them more in the show possibly than in the stories. Yeah, but it's interesting. There's only 2 that have names: Simpson and, can you name the other one?
Joe?
Wiggins.
Wiggins.
Yeah. And obviously Bertie is not a real town. Fictional town in India.
I watched it in subtitles and it's spelled differently.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. I think it was Bhurti or something.
Interesting.
But maybe because it was made up, somebody had to figure out what it was without looking at the book.
Yeah. There's not a lot in these books, as we've said, though I did find one note, which, again, it's kind of like the Martin Dakin conspiracy theory stuff, but it was by a different writer named Bruce Harris. He contends that Nancy did, in fact, kill her husband with the club, and that Henry Wood helped her to cover it up, and that Holmes wasn't even fooled. He just didn't care because justice was done, so he let it go at that.
That would be an interesting argument, since that's not how the story's written.
Well, but the people who have these conspiracy stories always have them from the point of view of, okay, either Holmes told something to Watson that wasn't true, so Watson would write a safe account, or Watson wrote a safe account knowing the real truth. You know what I mean? So I take it at face value, but I just always think it's funny that there's these alternate theories out there.
I think I take it at face value because, Watson makes it known when he thinks when justice wasn't done.
Right.
I don't know that he would cover it up.
Sure.
In these cases when there's people they don't care about.
Right.
Another line I thought was pretty great was when they talk about Teddy, the mongoose. In an instant, out there slipped a beautiful reddish creature, thin and lithe, with legs of a stout, thin, long nose, and a pair of the finest red eyes I ever saw on an animal's head.
Yeah. I really like that line, and it's funny because I don't know what animal they use in the show. I think it's just a ferret. I don't think it's actually a mongoose.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't have red eyes.
Right. I was talking about this with my wife because I thought for the longest time a mongoose and a ferret were just, one was English and one was American. But apparently mongooses are more closely related to cats, and ferrets are weasels, more related to dogs, bears, and seals.
Yeah, the thing about that, about the mongoose that got me, though, is that if you read the story, it says that Teddy was a snake catcher. And that that part of his act was that he would bring out this de-toothed cobra, and Teddy would wrangle him for the entertainment of the troops. And in the show,
they kind of just left out that he has a mongoose and a cobra.
Right. But it's more than that, though. It's like they're waiting for this big finale, and he just pulls a caged ferret out, and everybody oohs and ahs. I mean, I guess you could argue that maybe we don't see the end of the act, but it's just kind of...
Well, he turned a mouse into a mongoose.
Oh, is that what is supposed to have happened?
Yeah. Okay. Because he shoves a mouse in, and then he goes poof.
Well, he shoves a mouse in, and then it lights into flame. I thought he was like...
And then he lifts up a mongoose.
In a cage.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not a very good trick.
From a mouse to a mongoose.
Yeah. The fireball is the most impressive thing. Actually, the first time I ever saw that, I thought he was implying that he incinerated the mouse, but...
And then it turned into a mongoose.
Right.
But imagine if they weren't going to film the lamp... Now we have to film a cobra and a mongoose fighting.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure that was never going to happen, but I don't know. It works. What they did works. It's just a little bit, it's a little different than the story.
I think I can forgive that.
Sure.
The only other notes I made, I'll just read them. Jeremy Brett's face when Wood says the word Nancy. He's just got this little smile.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And then the jump cuts Yeah. When Wood appears.
Yeah.
With the lightning behind him.
The Flash Gordon lightning.
Yeah.
Yeah, you'd think they'd have more than one of that sound effect in their stock library because it's like the exact same sound effect
I don't
4
think
times in a row.
Anyone in the 80s had more than that sound effect.
Yeah.
It's everywhere.
Yeah. Well, let's pull it all together. I like I said at the beginning, I'm really kind of struggling to figure out where I place this one because the way I think about it in terms of Persian slippers, 9 and above is top tier.
Mm.
And I'm kind of struggling to decide if I want to place this one in the top tier. I think about all the episodes of this series, and is this one at the top? There's a lot of really great stuff in it, and frankly, Henry Wood's performance, it could put it over by itself. But the fact that I'm questioning it and wondering, I think I'm going to probably give this one an 8.9.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, mine are usually pretty ridiculous, I think, so far. But I think with all that in mind, I think of it as an episode of the series, not as how difficult it was to film.
Sure.
What they pulled off and perform. I do think about performances, but to me, when this episode comes up, I always think it's the man with a twisted lip, and I get more excited.
Same here.
And then when it starts, I'm like, oh, right, this one.
Right.
So, as much as I said I liked everything, I think I would give it my lowest score yet, which is 7.
Really?
Yeah.
7 even?
7 with a little bit of lint from the Persian slipper at manufacture.
Nice. Yeah, it's just tough. I mean, it's one of the early ones. It's, young Jeremy Brett. It's David Burke. They're both beyond exceptional in it. All the performances are amazing. I mean, I talk about it in the regular podcast. It's like every one of these actors is top notch. Even the people in the flashbacks all went on to have colossal careers.
I know, and even the actor who plays Barkley looks just like him.
Yeah, and even Nancy kind of sort of.
There's great things about it. It's just I think it's the story I don't like.
Yeah,
it's just that it doesn't. It's not really a mystery. The guy fell over and hit his head.
Yeah. And in one of the books, I think it might be the Klinger, I'm not sure, but it's like they make a big deal about the fact that it's a locked door mystery, but and that this is one of the first kind of locked door mysteries, and that's why it was kind of a big deal at the time. But it's not really a locked door mystery at all.
Yeah,
it's an open door mystery. The back door's open the whole time.
Right.
So I don't know. I don't know.
It's only a mystery for the servants.
Yeah. But when I think about it, and I think about the top tier of episodes, I can't say it's in the very top tier, but I do think it's. I mean, all these early ones are just so much better than the later ones, frankly, for the most part.
Yeah.
That I feel like I got to give it a nice nudge at least.
Well, I might regret saying 7 point lint, but
yeah, we can always revisit.
Yeah, I just feel like I said, when the twisted lip comes on, I just like it more.
Sure.
But I don't dislike it.
Yeah, it's a good one. Well, we've had quite a number of emails come in. And it's been really heartwarming, actually, to know that there's like so many Jeremy Brett, David Burke fans out there like us.
Yeah, when we started this podcast, we told our friends and they said, why?
And my answer was, well, I'd rather us do it than somebody else.
Yeah. Well, we talk about it so much that we figured if we like it this much, yeah, we should record it because someone else might like it. And I always say there's a market for everything.
Sure. But we have been getting some emails, and they've kind of been piling up, and I wanted to be able to read all of them on the show. But at this point, I think that'd be difficult. And it's really my fault because, again, last time we got robbed and everything got screwed up. And so it's just been hard to stay on top of stuff. But I wanted to get some of these voices on the show. I got a couple of the emails here in front of me, and I figured we'd just kind of scan through a few of them and say thanks to people for writing in. A very good friend of the show named David wrote in a number of emails, but the thing he pointed out in one of his early ones was that when he was a kid, he loved the Jeremy Brett series, but his favorite dramatization of Holmes has to go to the radio series starring Clive Marrison, which he says is outstanding. If we ever get a chance to give it a chance, I'm really excited to check it out. I've just been waiting for a long trip or a drive or something so I can absorb them. But yeah, I'm looking forward to listening to the Clive Marrison.
Just for the benefit of ourselves, me and people listening, You can find that on YouTube just by searching Sherlock Holmes, Clive Marison.
Yeah, and those shows ran between 89 and 98, apparently. So there's a complete canonical run, according to the internet, and it's available on CD and audio cassette as well as probably on YouTube. So
I wonder if that's the only full canonical run.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm really not sure about that. I don't think so. I think there's at least one other one I'm aware of, but it's in the back of my mind palace somewhere. We got another email from a friend of the show, David, who said, great podcast. As a Brit, I was surprised and pleased to find that this is run by Americans. Just a note on Bohemia, which was talked about in the first episode. Its history was complicated, certainly, but it was never part of the British Empire. Until 1948, it was an administrative unit of Czechoslovakia, so basic history that we should probably know. But I think in the first episode, I said something to the effect of I was confused because of the structure.
We were confused because we're American.
Right. Another note from a Patreon subscriber named Jeremy Brett Lover says, I'm writing in regards to Martin Dakin's reference to readers' capital mistake as regards to the story's title. Mr. Doyle's sentence structure and comma use is not sufficient evidence to confirm that the solitary cyclist is a person other than Miss Violet Smith. And then they go on to say, grammar and sentence structure is occasionally fluid and flexible. So basically what they're saying is it could go either way.
You know, I kind of agree with that because listening to it back when you read that the argument,
yeah,
I kind of was thinking the other way.
Yeah.
Even though
well, both ways are right, but it's just for somebody to say that it's wrong to think that the solitary cyclist is Violet Smith is not in fact correct.
Well, yeah.
I don't know if Conan Doyle ever clarified that for us, but I don't know the answer really.
Well, because you could say Violet Smith, comma, the solitary cyclist,
sure, or
Violet Smith, the solitary cyclist, and this other person.
Right. Yeah.
So then they're two people.
Right.
Or they're one.
It can go either way. So it's not definitive is I guess the point. But I was glad they wrote in to clarify that. We got a note from Karen saying, I was looking, unfortunately, in vain for Patrick Gower's soundtrack on Spotify and was excited to find your podcast instead.
Interesting.
But Karen was first introduced to the Granada series by her parents, who used to watch the show when it aired on Masterpiece. They had them recorded on VHS, and the first episode she ever saw was The Musgrave Ritual, and she fell in love with it and adores it to this day.
That's a good one, too.
Yeah, it really is. She said her only regret is that we never got to see A Study in Scarlet to witness Holmes and Watson meeting for the first time. She feels that would have been a hilarious scene. And I was just actually reading in one of the books the justification for why they didn't decide to start with that episode. And since there's not an episode, I doubt we'll ever really cover it. But Michael Cox said that it is essentially just it was such a heavy flashback story, and so much of it didn't involve Holmes and Watson that it just didn't make any sense to turn it into an episode. So,
well, if we do if we finish all of the episodes, we could maybe discuss why the other ones didn't get made.
Yeah, and as I go through the books, there are a lot of clues in there about certain ones. They talk about the Reigate Squire in this very episode at the beginning of the show. I mentioned that Michael Cox didn't want to do Crooked Man. He wanted to do Reigate Squire. They had the script written, and he really wanted to make that one, so we almost had that episode. But unfortunately didn't go that way. Karen also says she loves Colin Givons as Lestrade in The Six Napoleons especially, which I agree with entirely.
Yeah. I have a Napoleon statue at home.
I know. I keep wanting to get one, but I only want to get one if it's really close to the one in the show, and I can't find it.
But the one in the show is not close to Napoleon.
I know. That's why it's hard to find.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if we want to say this, but I would like for us to somehow get those made and then be able to sell them.
Let's try. I've cast things in plaster before, and
I have a whole list of things on my phone that I'm like, I want to own these things. And I'm sure other people do too.
Yeah.
And they wouldn't be that difficult to make. And we just wouldn't put branding all over it.
Right.
That's the one thing I hate about when you find a cool shirt or something from a TV show or a movie, there's always, they have to put the name of the movie really big. And exactly. I hate that.
Yeah. Well, it's something for us to look forward to doing in our declining years.
Yeah.
Another Chris writes in and says, hello, I'm very happy that the Granada series gets attention in 2019 since it sometimes seems that this series gets left behind when discussing Sherlock Holmes media. It's my mission as well to introduce people to the genius that was Jeremy Brett and David Burke and Edward Hardwicke. So it's also nice to hear other devoted Sherlockians discussing.
You know what I think it is? I think it's just the leapfrog effect. I think because the people making media right now or making media in the last 10 years are 10 or 20 years older than us. And so they were watching Basil Rathbone instead.
Sure.
And so that gets talked about, or the current one on TV gets talked about.
Right.
There was a time there when no one that I knew was talking about Queen.
Right.
And now that's the biggest thing ever.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's just people my age and a little bit older are now coming to prominence.
Sure.
So maybe it's going to blow up.
We're leading the forefront.
And then they're going to make a hologram of Jeremy Brett.
Yeah.
And remake the whole show.
Well, that would be cool. They could finish the show maybe if they can scan Jeremy Brett in. We got a note from Mari. She says, hello from Belgium. I'm an avid Sherlock Holmes and Jeremy Brett fan, have been since I watched the first series in the 80s, and I rewatched the Granada series on a continual basis, so it's nice to find people who are just as crazy about it as I am. The Solitary Cyclist is indeed one of the best episodes, but so is The Devil's Foot, The Second Stain, and The Dying Detective, and many more. There's plenty for you to analyze. Please keep up the good work.
Cool.
So that was nice. There's one more I'll read, and then maybe we'll save some for next time. But we got one from Richard that says, hello, I teach British history at the university level. One of my favorite classes to teach is Crime, Misery, and Vice, London and the Victorian Underworld. As you can imagine, Sherlock Holmes figures prominently. And then he kind of shares a lot of his opinions about the episodes we've covered. He says, so far as Scandal is concerned, it's among my least favorite of the series as well, but being among the least favorite of the best imaginable is still pretty good. In fact, it's damn good. I was weirded out by David Burke since I had cut my teeth on Edward Hardwicke in The Empty House and didn't see the adventures until they came back in reruns, but taking everything as a whole, David Burke is my favorite.
We were young.
Yeah.
Many good lines.
Yeah. He also remains traumatized by the resident patient dream sequence, as I mentioned once. Also, funny enough, Richard says he lives next door to Betsy Brantley, Elsie Cubitt, and apparently she still does voice work, including lots of video games and stuff, which I'll have to look up because I didn't catch that one when I was looking. And he also says he used to use the Dancing Men as code when he was younger, and he agrees that it does take quite a lot longer to do than regular letters.
This is apropos of almost nothing, except for what you just said. But I'm working on a guitar strap, and I was going to do a little bit of leather work, and it takes forever to stamp in little individual pieces of leather work. But as I was thinking about doing it, I was thinking I should just put a couple of Dancing Men in.
Yeah.
Maybe I will.
That'd be cool. And then he says some other things, but the last thing he says, which I thought was a great way to end this, is that he says, it was quite a treat listening, and if you continue at the rate of an episode every month or so, I know I have several years worth of good listening ahead of me. So, thanks, Richard. We'll get there. Okay, well, before we go, I just wanted to take a moment to mention our Patreon once again. We're slowly growing there, but if anyone out there would like to help us keep this ship afloat, any Patreon funds that we're lucky enough to receive go towards web hosting fees and all the good stuff that accompanies hosting a podcast. And your help is sincerely appreciated. And you can find us at patreon.com/Sherlock Podcast. As for those who are currently helping us out, we appreciate you more than you know. And we'd also like to take a moment to give a quick special thanks to our new listeners, followers, reviewers, and friends. Rez RR, Min, Flick, Richard, Shane, Georgina, Z, Lee, Rick, Sarah, John, Battered Tin, Quinton, Thomas, Vladimir, Gretchen, David, Karen, Chris, and Mari, and everyone on the Facebook groups Sherlock Holmes fans and Sherlock Holmes Jeremy Brett who have been talking about the podcast, as well as Karen's brettholmes.tumblr.com. Thank you all so much for taking the time to come along with us on our little journey back into television history. We're very glad to have you with us, and if you'd like to get your voice on the show, we'd be glad to hear from you at contact@sherlockpodcast.com. Well, I think that's all from us this time, but join us on the next show when we discuss yet another classic in the series, The Speckled Band. Until then.